They say you can tell everything you need to know about a person by how they treat a neighbor's hobby. And in my line of work, that's usually where the trouble starts, with a man, a garage, and a woman who has far too much time and an overinflated sense of community standards. My name is Mike Harrison, and for 12 years I've worked as a detective in the fraud unit, a job that teaches you to look at the world through a lens of documentation and patterns. But when I'm not under the fluorescent lights of the precinct, I'm under the hood of a 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429. That car isn't just metal and rubber to me. It's 15 years of hunting down original parts. It's the smell of Calypso, coral paint, and high-octane fuel. And it sits in my detached garage alongside a 1970 Chevy Camaro Z28 and a 1971 plum crazy purple Dodge Challenger. 3 pieces of American history worth $220,000. And apparently, a one-way ticket to a war I didn't even know I was fighting. The thing about my property in Pinewood Estates is that I did my homework before I ever signed the deed. You see, my garage sits on a separately deeded plot of land that was grandfathered in as commercial property long before the HOA ever existed, meaning it's a legal island in a sea of beige houses and manicured lawns. But Karen Whitfield, our newly elected HOA president, didn't care about deeds or history or the law. She only cared about the aesthetic integrity of the cul-de-sac. Karen is 52, a retired real estate agent with the kind of aggressive efficiency that makes you feel like you're being audited just by saying hello, and she moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago with one goal: to clean up the street. To her, my garage wasn't a restoration business. It was an eyesore, a haven for abandoned vehicles, and she started leaving these increasingly frantic notices in my mailbox, each one more colorful than the last, demanding I remove the environmental hazards immediately. I kept every single one of those letters, of course, because 12 years of detective work burns a certain habit into your DNA. You document everything, you observe the escalation, and you wait for the mistake. I watched her through my security cameras, a $4,000 system with cloud backup and motion tracking that she didn't even know was there, and I'd see her doing these slow drive-bys in her white SUV, or standing in my property line with a measuring tape like she was plotting a military invasion. She'd spend 14 minutes on her phone, gesturing wildly at my garage door, her face turning a shade of red that almost matched my Mustang, and I could tell she was building a narrative in her head, rationalizing that her good intentions for the neighborhood justified whatever line she was about to cross. The tension was a slow burn, a creeping mold in the foundation of our neighborly relations, and I could see action coming from a mile away, especially when I mentioned to a neighbor that I'd be heading to Quantico for a 10-day federal training seminar. Quantico, the FBI Academy, is a place of total digital isolation, phones surrendered, days spent in immersive evidence-handling workshops. And to someone like Karen, it was a 10-day window where the quiet guy with the cars would be gone and unable to fight back. I saw the silhouette of her at her kitchen window that night, phone pressed to her ear, and I knew she was making a move. I knew she thought that if she could just make the problem disappear while I was gone, the results would justify the means. I left on a Sunday morning, the garage locked tight behind an electronic system, and my daily driver Honda heading toward Virginia, leaving behind 3 classic cars that represented my life's work and a security system that was ready to witness the greatest mistake of Karen Whitfield's life. While I was sitting in seminars about interstate fraud and digital evidence, Karen was back home, conducting what she thought was a brilliant undercover operation, testing my phone lines, ringing my doorbell, and confirming that the coast was truly clear. She had convinced herself that my cars were abandoned, a legal keyword she'd found in some obscure county environmental regulation, and she figured that as long as I wasn't there to protest, an emergency removal would be seen as a heroic act of community service. But here's the thing about people who think they're smarter than the system. They always leave a trail. They always think that a fake name or a burner email is enough to hide the truth from a man who spends 40 hours a week hunting people exactly like them. Karen didn't just want the cars gone. She wanted to be the one who saved the street from the imaginary chemicals she claimed were leaking into the groundwater, and she was about to turn a simple neighborhood dispute into a felony-level fraud investigation. I spent my first night in Virginia reviewing the motion alerts on my laptop before we had to surrender our devices, watching her walk the perimeter of my garage with a manila folder, pressing her face against a glass to count the hazards. And I remember thinking, go ahead, Karen, pull the trigger. See what happens when you try to out-detective a detective. The irony was thick enough to choke on, because as I was learning the newest protocols for building airtight criminal cases, Karen was busy creating the perfect evidence package for her own prosecution, documenting her own trespasses and preparing to lie to every legitimate agency in the county. She had this look on her face in the footage, this smug, self-righteous glow, the look of a woman who believes that being the HOA president gives her the power of a high court judge and an environmental marshal all rolled into one. She didn't know that my garage wasn't part of her little kingdom, and she certainly didn't know that every lie she was about to tell was being uploaded in high definition to a cloud server 300 miles away. But she was about to find out, and the price of that lesson was going to be much higher than any HOA fine she could ever dream of. The thing about people like Karen is that they don't just break the law, they perform it. They act out this little play where they're the hero, the protector, the thin blue line between a nice neighborhood and total suburban decay. And as the sun rose on Monday morning back in Pinewood Estates, Karen Whitfield was ready for her opening night. I was miles away in a classroom at Quantico, learning about the digital footprint of white-collar criminals, while Karen was putting on her official navy blazer and grabbing a manila folder filled with bureaucratic fiction. My security cameras caught it all. The way she marched toward my garage at 7:30 a.m. with the posture of a general, the way she took methodical, close-up photos of my Mustang's tires as if they were evidence of a crime, and the way she stood back, nodding to herself, satisfied that her case was built. At 8:15, she made the call, the one that turned a petty feud into a felony. And thanks to the high-gain microphone on my porch camera, I could hear her voice, crisp and professional, but layered with a lie so bold it made my skin crawl. "This is Lisa Thompson," she told the dispatcher at Riverside Towing. "I'm the property manager for Pinewood Estates HOA, and we have an emergency environmental hazard on Maple Street. Multiple abandoned vehicles leaking petroleum products into the soil." Lisa Thompson. She didn't just lie. She invented a ghost, a fictional character with a fictional job title, and she even went as far as to set up a fake email, lisa.thompson@pinewood.com, just to give her shadow some substance. Riverside Towing didn't know they were being used as an instrument in a heist. They just saw a professional-looking woman with official county environmental hazard forms and an indemnification agreement that promised the HOA would take all the heat if things went sideways. Tommy Carter, the driver, arrived in a heavy-duty flatbed and looked at my pristine Camaro and my plum-crazy Challenger with a skeptical eye, probably wondering why abandoned cars looked like they belonged on the cover of a magazine. But Karen, or Lisa, was right there with her folder, pointing at a tiny oil stain on the concrete that was probably from a lawnmower 3 years ago, talking about groundwater contamination and emergency remediation protocols. She signed those papers with a flourishes, using a modified version of her handwriting that I'd later recognize in a heartbeat. And for 3 hours, I watched my life's work being winched onto the back of a truck while my neighbor watched from her porch, sipping tea and thinking she'd finally won. I didn't see the footage until Saturday evening, during our 1-hour communication window at the academy. And when that empty garage floor flickered onto my laptop screen, I felt a surge of adrenaline that was colder than any winter morning on the beat. The rage was there, sure, a hot, throbbing pulse in my temples, but it was quickly replaced by something much more dangerous. The cold, calculating mind of a fraud detective who had just been handed a textbook case on a silver platter. I saw her face. I heard the name Lisa Thompson, and I watched the $220,000 worth of American muscle disappear around the corner, destined for an impound lot where they'd be processed as environmental waste. Karen hadn't just moved my cars. She'd stolen them by deception, used a fraudulent identity to bypass legal protections, and she did it all while smiling at the camera she didn't know existed. The rest of the week was a test of my own restraint. I had to sit through seminars on interstate coordination while my stomach was doing backflips, knowing that every second my car sat in that yard, they were at risk of being damaged or processed into scrap. I called home to check my messages and heard the silence. 3 calls from Karen's number in the first 2 days, no messages left, just a predator checking if the prey was still out of town. She was so confident, so sure that her Lisa Thompson persona would shield her from the consequences, that she probably spent that week bragging to the rest of the board about how she'd finally cleared the blight from Maple Street. When I finally pulled into my driveway on Sunday night, the Honda's headlights swept across the closed garage door, and for a split second, I hoped it was all a bad dream. But the electronic lock showed green, and when the door rolled up, the silence that greeted me was deafening. Just an empty concrete floor, a few mounting brackets where my tool cabinets used to be, and a faint, lingering scent of old motor oil. $220,000 of my life, gone, replaced by shadows. I stood there for a long time, not moving, just letting the silence sink in, and I realized that Karen hadn't just attacked my hobby. She'd attacked the one place where I felt like I wasn't a cop. I walked back into the house, fired up the laptop, and started a new folder on my desktop labeled The People versus Whitfield. I didn't call the precinct. Not yet. I wanted the evidence to be so overwhelming that the responding officers wouldn't even have to ask a question. I spent all night cross-referencing the video with the documents I'd later retrieved from Riverside Towing. I zoomed in on her face as she signed the fake name. I captured the exact moment Tommy Carter looked at the Challenger's VIN number, and I mapped out the legal reality of what she'd done. Identity fraud, false reporting, and grand theft. Monday morning, I walked into Riverside Towing, not as a neighbor, but as a victim, letting my anger show just enough to make Tommy Carter uncomfortable. "You guys took 3 cars from my garage," I said, dropping my registration and insurance papers on the counter with a thud that echoed in the small office. Tommy looked at the papers, then at me, and I could see the color draining from his face as he realized the abandoned cars were currently insured for more than his house. A lady named Lisa Thompson authorized it. Property manager for Pinewood, he stammered, handing me the folder she'd left behind. I looked at the environmental hazard report, at the fake email, and then at the signature at the bottom. It was Karen's handwriting, no doubt about it, the same loops and slashes from those 7 HOA notices. "Tommy," I said, my voice dropping into that quiet, terrifying detective tone, "there is no Lisa Thompson, and this isn't an HOA property. You've been used to commit a felony." He looked like he was going to be sick, but he led me out to the yard, and there they were, my 3 beauties sitting in the disposal row, dusty but intact. I stood there, looking at my Mustang, and I knew that the next 48 hours weren't just about getting my cars back. They were about a public execution of Karen Whitfield's reputation. She thought she was playing a game of suburban chess, but she'd forgotten one thing. When you play against a detective, every move you make is just more evidence for the file. I was going to let her stand up at the HOA meeting on Thursday. I was going to let her take her victory lap in front of the whole neighborhood. And then I was going to show her exactly what happens when you try to outsmart a man who gets paid to find people exactly like her. The trap was set. The evidence was backed up to 3 different servers. And as I drove home, I found myself actually smiling, because Karen Whitfield was about to learn that good intentions are a very poor defense against a 20-year prison sentence. Thursday evening arrived with a chill in the air that felt like a sharp warning, and as I walked toward the Pinewood Estates Community Center, I felt a strange sense of calm, the kind of stillness a hunter feels when the target is finally walking into the clearing. I was carrying a single manila folder, tucked under my arm like a casual prop, but inside was a digital and paper trail that would dismantle Karen Whitfield's life piece by piece. The room was buzzing. Maybe 25 neighbors sitting in those plastic folding chairs, gossiping about lawn fertilizer and holiday lights, unaware that they were about to witness a forensic autopsy of crime. Karen was at the front table, wearing a navy blazer and a look of triumphant grace, the kind of expression a queen wears when she's finally banished the court jester. She called the meeting to order at 7:30 sharp, her voice ringing out with a terrifying level of confidence. "Before we get to the budget," she began, a smug smile playing on her lips, "I have some wonderful news regarding our ongoing efforts to maintain the aesthetic integrity of Maple Street. After months of warnings, we have finally successfully executed an environmental remediation of the abandoned vehicle blight in our southern corridor." A few neighbors nodded, Mrs. Wilson even clapped, and Karen basked in it like it was a standing ovation at the Oscars. She went on for 5 minutes about groundwater safety and decisive leadership, painting herself as the savior of our property values. I sat in the very back row, my face a mask of bored indifference, until she asked if there were any questions. I stood up slowly, the silence in the room following me as I walked toward the front. "I have a question, Karen," I said, my voice echoing off the linoleum. "I'm curious about the proper channels you mentioned. Specifically, who is Lisa Thompson?" The color didn't leave her face all at once. It leaked out, starting at her neck and moving up until her cheeks were the color of damp chalk. I don't know what you're talking about, Mike," she stammered, her fingers tightening around her gavel. I didn't raise my voice. I just opened the folder and pulled out a high-resolution blow-up of my security footage, the frame where she was standing in front of my garage, signing the tow slip with a flourish. "That's funny," I said, laying on the table in front of her, "because Lisa Thompson is the name you used to sign this environmental hazard report. And Lisa Thompson is the name on the fake email address you used to defraud Riverside Towing." The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. I pulled out the second sheet, the HOA notice she'd sent me 2 months ago, and laid it right next to the fraudulent tow authorization. "Handwriting analysis is a basic part of my job, Karen," I said, finally letting a bit of the detective's edge slip into my tone. "The loops on the L, the slant of the T, it's a perfect match. You didn't just move my cars. You committed identity fraud and theft by deception of property valued at over $200,000. If you can't prove that," she hissed, but her voice was brittle, cracking under the weight of 25 pairs of eyes. "Actually, I can," I replied, and that's when I pulled out my badge. I didn't slam it down. I just set it on the table next to the photos. "My name is Detective Mike Harrison, Metropolitan Fraud Unit. And for the last 10 days while I was at Quantico, my security system, which records in 4K with cloud backup, by the way, captured every single second of your little performance. I have you on video inventing a persona. I have you on video lying to a contractor, and I have the witness statement from the driver you defrauded." The shift in the room was violent. Mrs. Wilson gasped, and Mr. Peterson, who had been Karen's biggest supporter, stood up and walked away from her table like it was on fire. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the back row. "You thought I was a maintenance man, didn't you? You thought I was just some quiet guy you could bully because I didn't attend your bake sales. But here's the reality. Identity fraud is a Class D felony. Theft by deception over 100,000 is a Class B. You're looking at 10 to 20 years, Karen. Is the visual harmony of the neighborhood worth that?" She collapsed in her chair, the official blazer suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for her. The meeting didn't just adjourn, it erupted. A vote of no confidence was called and passed in under 90 seconds. Karen sat there, staring at the badge on the table, as the life she'd built on a foundation of beige paint and rules crumbled into dust. By Friday afternoon, my cars were back in my garage, delivered personally by the owner of Riverside Towing, who was so terrified of a secondary fraud suit that he offered to detail them for free. Karen's "for sale" sign went up 3 days later. She moved to Austin before the month was out, likely hoping to find a neighborhood where no one knew about Lisa Thompson. But in the digital age, a felony record tends to travel faster than a moving truck. I'm back in my garage now, the smell of Calypso coral paint and old leather filling the air again. The new HOA board leaves me alone. In fact, they've started asking my advice on security and jurisdictional boundaries. As for Karen, she learned the hardest lesson of all, that when you try to play God in a cul-de-sac, you'd better make sure your neighbor isn't the one who writes the reports. But it makes me think, how many of you are living next to a Karen who thinks the rules don't apply to them? Have you ever had to pull back the curtain on an HOA president who went too far? Or maybe you think I was too harsh on a woman just trying to improve the street. Tell me in the comments. Was this justice or just a detective taking a busman's holiday? I want to hear your HOA horror stories, and let's settle once and for all. Who's the real villain when the property lines get blurred? Hit that subscribe button, because the truth always has a way of coming home to roost. Now, I gotta ask, did I go too far? Or was Karen getting exactly what she deserved for playing with fire? The law is black and white, but neighborly disputes are always gray. Let's debate it in the comments. Have you ever caught an HOA official in a lie? Share your story, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more satisfying takedowns of the entitled elite.